Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over the forgotten lore of... Sorry. It takes a village and a half to put me together, but alas, after 2.5 years, I have a microphone and a light. Thank you to the village that put me together. So, for today's video, I need to give a little bit of context. I mean, I don't need to, but I want to. So, in the last video, I was more or less talking about my taste in books, some preferences that I clearly have, some things that I gravitate towards. And obviously when I did that, I looked at my bookshelf and I looked at my ebook as well to see what books I had. I looked at my audiobooks because I like them. I like them. Controversial for some people. And I noticed something, which is the prevalence of one very specific author in my collection. And it was kind of interesting because I didn't necessarily think about it that much beforehand. And that author, my friends, is Virginia Woolf. Now, I have over here the entirety of my 4 books, which is actually 5 because this one this one specifically is technically 2 books. It's A Room of One's Own, and then it's 3 Guineas. And I also read Orlando and Mrs. Dalloway, which I don't think I have here. Yeah. And those were read as an audiobook. So I listened to them. Okay, I didn't read them, whatever you want to call it. I won't judge you. But I am very well acquainted with this lady right here. And now, I want to have a discussion about my opinions on her writing, because I feel like I've gotten to know her style and what she's all about decently well, as much as I can, right? From a subjective lens, and maybe you're looking for suggestions and seeing if this is worth it to invest in a book by her. I can help, I hope. Now, let me give you a little bit of context on how my relationship with this woman started. So, we were strangers until I started to look into more feminist literature. And I mean, the first thing that you open up when you search that kind of thing is probably her. So that's what I did. And, well, story's not that interesting, actually, now that I think about it. But let me start with the first book that I ever read by her and why specifically I liked it. So, the first book that I read is A Room of One's Own. I would argue, and this might be controversial, that this is the book that you should start with. And not just because I started with it, but I don't think I would have been as curious if I didn't start with this one. Probably. Why? Because I feel like it's more accessible than her fiction works, at least for me. In itself, A Room of One's Own is basically an essay. It's 113 pages, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, she wrote this for a lecture that she was supposed to give regarding women in fiction. The central point of this whole essay, of all of these pages, is basically how... You know what? Let me rephrase that. Instead of giving you the old, tedious, annoying, boring history lesson that she could have given, she exemplifies very well through some theoretical examples the difference between being a man and a woman at that time, being a genius, and how you're perceived, or what, no, not how you're perceived, what you have access to depending on your gender. So it was never about intelligence in the first place. That's kind of the point that she makes. She also says very vividly and very directly through the stories that women have never really written poorer quality books or literature than men. It's just that they didn't have as many resources. They didn't have as much time. They had to take care of things like mending stockings and cooking and taking care of children, which at that time men didn't have to do. And that doesn't prove that they are better writers than women. What she really argues is that, in general, genius takes some degree of freedom, which women did not have equal to men at that time. And it's a very good point that I think you could start with. I'm trying to not give spoilers, but there is one specific part of it where she kind of imagines this sister, hypothetical sister of Shakespeare. How she would be just as talented as Shakespeare if she existed, and she just would not have access to all of the things that he did. So he would be at home writing, and she would probably only write at nighttime when she had time after cooking and taking care of the household and the kids and all of that. How he would be thriving, and she would probably unalive herself in the misery of knowing that probably her only purpose in that society and time, arguably, is to take care of the family and have children and be a mother and a wife. So I told you what to start with. Let me go next into what I think you should end with, and that is The Waves by Virginia Woolf. What is The Waves? The Waves is basically a coming-of-age story, if you really look at it. The reason why I say I think you should end with this is because, by my standards, it has a rather experimental nature. It's an experimental fiction work, if you ask me. So, the story in itself follows these 6 friends. However, they don't really intersect all that much, as you would normally see in the books that have this kind of topic. And give me 1 second, because I'm going to try to remember their names, and I do poorly at that. Bernard, Susan, Rhoda, Neville, I think there was Lewis, and Jenny. Anyways, the book in itself follows them from being children, from childhood to old age, pretty much. And it kind of looks at how their identities formed throughout time and how their consciousness changed and everything. But I will say, there is no dialogue. The book in itself is actually constructed on these internal monologues that alternate between each other, and there isn't really a plot. There isn't really an arc. So there's that. Now, the thing that separates these chapters sometimes is these really picturesque, Jesus, that was a weird pronunciation, descriptions of the sun moving across the sky and over the ocean, and kind of symbolizes the passage of time, if you think about it. And while I think it's gorgeous, and it's arguably, I think it's been deemed by critiques one of her best works, if not her best, it's definitely not a plot you can follow. I would recommend reading it in summer, and I would recommend not thinking about it too much, honestly. It can be quite abstract, and there is no clear story. You kind of just have to drift with the waves when it comes to this story, so there's my warning with that one. I actually take the moment to mention, right specifically with this one, that there's a lyricism to her prose that is, to me, completely irreplicable. It sounds like a lyre in my head. It's so well thought, but so softly placed, and yet so symbolic. So it is a masterpiece, and it is beautiful to read, but it might take some time. And I noticed that with a lot of her fiction works, I kind of have that tendency, but I always end up craving it more and more. And the thing is, in my own writing style, I think I project that mostly I also go into that direction. She has inspired quite a bit of my way of writing, probably, when I look at it. I apologize for the change of light. My light gave out and I only have the normal bulbs. But I have here To the Lighthouse. And this one for me was an interesting read. I don't recommend reading it extensively because you're going to forget what happened. It's not a book with a crazy plot with a lot to, so you might forget. My PSA to you. In itself, the book is basically made up of 3 parts. Those parts being the first one, which is the window, where you get to meet these characters. Imagine the book kind of like the story of a house or the story of a family and its degradation, except it's done in a very straightforward, almost brutal way at some points. The first chapter, however, introduces you to these colliding worlds of these 2 parents, the mother, who is kind of like the glue of the family. She's warm, she represents the hope, she's the light of the family, in a sense. And then the father, who is this hard truth guy, who is this buzzkill, realistically speaking. That's kind of what he is, and then the kids. You get some pretty, quote-unquote, mundane descriptions. It doesn't feel like something tremendously out of this world, but it feels beautiful in its simplicity. The middle part, however, is probably the most famous and the most shocking one. 10 years have passed. The house is empty, and you get death scenes for some of the characters, and not in the way that you might expect. As much as I feel like the rest can be verbose, this specific chapter basically tells you in brackets how some of the characters died. And it's shocking in how quick and fast it all just goes away completely. But I will say this book is actually rooted in Virginia Woolf's own life, in the sense that her own mother died when she was just 13, her favorite brother died, and those are themes that she explores her grief through this book in a very interesting way. After the middle chapter, with all of this sudden loss, this interruption that is completely brutal and honestly kind of jarring, you have the last chapter, which kind of gives meaning and engulfs everything in some kind of, this was the point of it. So, the last chapter is called The Lighthouse, very symbolically, and it basically depicts the father gathering the remaining family and going towards the lighthouse with one of the kids, realizing that this lighthouse is in fact a metaphor for both his father's perspective, which is just a bunch of rocks that mean absolutely nothing, and the magical perspective of his mother, that this is somehow representative of his childhood and nostalgia, and it has so much meaning to it. And in the midst of that, there is also a new character, and that is Lily Briscoe, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong, which is this artist guest that sets up an easel. She's been trying for the last 10 years to reproduce the scene, and she does so by the end. And somehow this kind of wraps up in the conclusion that where life fails, art prevails. So take that. Okay, I will explain further. I mean, in the sense of how the mother tried to keep this beauty of life afloat, how the mother tried to make life permanent in a way, and she couldn't because of sudden events. And how ultimately the only thing that managed to immortalize things was art. Full disclosure, this is once again sort of a plotless book. So if you're looking for something that's going to catch your attention, this is not that. Read this on the beach. I recommend. On to probably the shortest and sweetest one you're going to read, that is Flush. Now, Flush is technically a book about 2 characters, but it's written from the perspective of the dog. Whose dog? Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a famous poet. So, basically, the dog acts as a mirror. They act as a mirror to each other, the two characters, but the dog acts as a mirror to the poet, in a sense. Somehow, him living in such an enclosed space, instead of smelling grass, he sits on the rug. And instead of smelling the air, he smells this eau de cologne or something like that, or perfume. And somehow his entrapment in rooms, and you get the gist of it, is symbolic of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's entrapment in her illness, and also by her father. But ultimately, obviously, by the end, there is some liberation. Elizabeth goes to Italy with Robert Browning, and Flush gets his fur trimmed, cut, and he's now a real dog with a new fur coat, and he runs around freely with no leash. He's a libertine. Now, for a book that I do not unfortunately have physically, and that is one of my favorites, if not my favorite, just because of how beautifully the prose is written by my standards, Orlando. This book kind of touches on topics such as gender roles, sexuality, as much as it can, obviously, for the time. It's done very politely. And it really puts into perspective the norms of a certain time when it comes to gender expression. So, at first, Orlando is a man. His life is filled with bad poetry, entertaining parties. He lives in this lavish space, obviously, has lots of money, and the ladies love him, and he falls in love with a lady, a Russian lady. Now, here's the kicker. At some point, he goes to Constantinople, and over there, he falls into a trance, and then he wakes up a woman. What happens then? Everything about his life changes, and he becomes constrained to what it means to be a woman. He marries, and he marries with somebody that kind of, their dynamic really challenges the traditional energies of a relationship, of a heterosexual relationship, because neither one of them is particularly attuned to their own gender in some sense. But that kind of makes it work. Obviously, there's also mentions of homosexuality, and at some points Orlando visits some sex workers, but nothing happens. So there's those discussions. If you didn't know, in Virginia Woolf's personal life, she did have a lover on the side of her marriage, which was Vita Sackville. I forgot. It was Vita. I will put her full name. And somehow the character of Orlando is based on her lover, Vita, and her inability, if I'm not mistaken, just because she was a woman, to get a house, to inherit a house, something along those lines. But it's really beautifully done, and I can't recommend that one enough. I really enjoyed it. Other than that, I feel like I've painted a picture of most of what I've read from her and what I would recommend. But the thing is, I do have some mentions because I don't think she's going to be for everybody. So if you're uncomfortable with discussions about sexuality, gender norms, anything along those lines, don't go for it. If you like plots that are very action heavy or very engaging and very fast, I don't think that she's the one for you. Some would argue, and I've had this discussion with my mom also, because she tried to read Virginia Woolf when she was younger, and she got this feeling that there was something very pretentious about the way that she writes, and I can agree that she is slightly fancy and can be very, not very, but florally in language. She does try to make things pretty. But I think for what it's worth, it's never overdone or done in trying to sound smart. I think she's just very detailed in the way that she tries to go about things, and I personally appreciate that a lot. I think she can be she finds an equilibrium between building atmosphere and giving you details so you feel like you're part of the action, and also building a relationship with the characters. But her topics are not always the lightest, that's for sure. And there's definitely some personal biases or discussions of class that come through in some of her works that are, again, very poignant discussions, but I'm sure that that's not something everybody's into. Everybody has their own taste, and some people prefer straight action and fiction that doesn't have overt discussion, although admittedly every single one has discussion of topics that are rooted in real life, but they're not as overt. So if you're not into that, she's not really your gal. Yeah, I don't think she's necessarily the easiest person to read, but I think it's worth it, and I definitely think people should start with the essays. Somehow I feel like they're a bit more friendly on the brain. She makes some really good points, and she does well at illustrating her points in theoretical examples. So with that is my gist on Virginia Woolf, and why I like her so much, why she is as well represented as you've seen in my book collection, which is not as vast as I wish it would be, but hey, we're getting there. And a lot of books I haven't bought physically. So with that, I hope you enjoyed. I hope I give you an idea of what goes on and what I like about her stuff and what I would tell people to steer away from if they're not into those things. In that spirit, yes, I guess. In that spirit, I'll leave you with kisses. Hope you're well, as per usual. Hope you're having a good time, and let me know how you feel about her. Let me know what you disagree and agree with. Let me know anything. I'll be here. And I'll see you next week, hopefully. Thank you so much for sitting with me through this.